in the interest of moving along our time, the time schedule, I won't delay. My name is Nicholas DiGenova. I'm a reader in urban geography here at King's, and just recently joined the geography department. It's my pleasure to introduce this session, which is notably titled Forging the Urban Future, Innovative Problem Solving. So I detected over the course of the day and in the progress of the conversation a kind of moving from an analysis of problems to an increasing interest in trying to formulate ways to grapple with solutions of various kinds. And I think that that is intended to be the sort of focal point of this session. I just want to introduce our first speaker then, Jerome, who is the director of Arup, which is a company that he will tell you a bit more about himself. Welcome, Jerome.
Okay, I think I do come at this the topic that I was given, reducing the risk for innovative projects, from a rather anecdotal basis, because I'm going to base what I'm going to talk about very much on my sort of personal experience over the last 10 years in working on quite a number of sort of major projects. But I should start by giving you a bit about my background, because I think it's relevant. The first thing is to say is that I work for a company that some of you may have heard of, Arup, but it's very diverse in what we do, and a lot of the topics today I think are incredibly relevant to the fields in which we're working all the way across the globe at the moment. And there are some real differences and challenges, I think, being faced in different parts of the globe, which our company is really trying to get to grips with through collaboration, I think, across some of the boundaries. The second thing I would say is that before I joined Arup 2 years ago, I was the head of design and regeneration for the London Olympics, for the Olympic Delivery Authority, the agency set up to deliver the Olympics in London, deliver the capital works for the Olympics, the infrastructure and the buildings primarily. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is my experience in that process. I was there for 6 years, through to the beginning of 2012. And then the last thing I would say is that I personally am a town planner, and I was intrigued by one of the previous speakers saying there are 3 types of planners, I think he said. I was struggling to work out which one I am, actually. You said design, policy and analysis, and I think certainly in my career I've done all 3, but I think I would favour design.
If you're senior enough, you do all 3.
Yeah, well I would say my tendency is much more towards design. If that's about trying to solve problems, then I think that's where I'd favour. But what I would argue is that one of the things that I struggle with is actually working outside the planning field, and yet the delivery of major projects requires that. So I'm a useless project manager, I would say. And it's a real art to be a good project manager, and something I'm not very good at understanding. So in terms of reducing the risk for innovative projects, I think my starting point is to think about, what are innovative projects, and you've heard about a whole multitude of them at the moment. And I would say at the moment I'm engaged in everything from super sewers, high-speed rail, major new town development in this country and abroad, and inner city urban regeneration in places like South Africa. And there are some very common themes actually to what might seem to be a very diverse set of projects that I think are beginning to emerge consistently. I think one of the things that I would argue is that in the last 10 years our ability to technically project manage projects has improved vastly. Certainly in the UK it's improved vastly, and I think it's consistent across the globe, in that we have better tools at our disposal to understand things like costs. I put this image up here. This is a structure known as Watkins Folly. I don't know whether any of you recognise it. I wouldn't expect you to, because it was built in 1894. It got as far as you can see on here. It was supposed to be a structure that would rival, indeed be bigger than the Eiffel Tower, constructed in Wembley in the Metroland that one of the other speakers' slide put up. Edward Watkin was a private entrepreneur who decided that it was not right that France should have the tallest building in Europe at that point, and that we needed one. But he got this far before he ran out of money. He simply didn't understand the cost of what this kind of structure might entail. I think nowadays we are better at understanding cost, and when we have the money, we do, I think, take greater comfort in our ability to deliver projects within budget. That might be a recent phenomenon, and interestingly, this structure, or the footings of this structure, sit underneath Wembley Stadium right now, and that's probably the last time I would say in this country that we really got the costs wrong on a major project. I think since then we've learned a lot from that, and we can better manage costs. So I don't think cost these days and budgeting for projects is necessarily a big risk challenge. This image is of the Sydney Opera House. I'm sure you'll recognise it, but this is what made the name of the founder of my company, Ove Arup, was called in to save this project because, as the anecdotes go at least, the architect had drawn a beautiful drawing but didn't know how to make the building stand up because it was so, the engineering challenge behind it was so way ahead of its time. Ove Arup's response to that was to do the drawings by hand that solved the problem and got the building to what it is today, the building built in all its magnificence. And yet today, you don't need to do those kind of hand drawings to create the most amazing structures that seem to defy physics. This is one of my favourite images of me standing next to the orbit, what's known as the ArcelorMittal orbit, a sculpture in effect that was built in the Olympic Park. It was modelled by about 3 people sitting around a computer. It was then built by 2 people and constructed on site by 2 people in a crane, in a basket hung off a crane, with very few other people involved in the process. One sort of project manager at the base, sort of making sure that they didn't do anything they shouldn't do, and clearly a lot of programming that went on behind it. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is the technological challenges behind major innovations these days are not quite as difficult as they used to be because we have the modelling tools that help us define the solutions and allow us to test the solutions not just in terms of design but in the way in which they might get built. So we know what might go wrong from an early stage and we can plan for that. So I don't think technology is the biggest risk to the technological solutions and the way in which we solve problems is the big risk to major project delivery. This image is of the protest that took place in Brazil this year against the World Cup, and they spun out actually out of protests against the rise in bus fares, I think, in Rio, but very quickly turned into a protest against the World Cup. The underlying theme being what a waste of money, and shouldn't we be spending our money on something else to advance the country. This protest is the one against the high-speed rail station in Stuttgart, Stuttgart 21, which not only stopped the project but changed the local government. The Green Party won the election on the back of the protests raised against that high-speed rail project, and to this day it's not advancing. And of course in this country we have our very own protests, if you like, around our big piece of infrastructure, and I'm sure those of you who listen to the radio every morning will hear daily the commentary around High Speed 2, will it go ahead, won't it go ahead, and what are the arguments for and against. And I think at the moment we're hearing the arguments for changing actually as we listen almost weekly. But the common thing around those protests, I think, is that increasingly they are middle-class protests. And what we're seeing, and we haven't heard a lot about today, is the rise of the middle classes. In this country, clearly the rise of the middle class has been taking place for quite some time. And we are actually, I think, at a stage where we're quite used to dealing with protest or dealing with opposition to major projects from the middle classes, and the way in which we react to them, I think, is exemplified in the way in which we manage the Olympics. These figures are the recent findings, I think, of the Brookings Institute, which suggests that the middle class population of the world will treble over the next 10 years and will reach a figure of around 5 billion by 2030. And I think this is quite significant when we start to consider the risks to the delivery of major innovative projects, because the middle classes are the greatest consumers in our society. And consumers, of course, have to make choices about what they spend their money on. And our urban middle classes, I think, have become very sophisticated in developing a sense of value. You know, what should I spend my money on? What's the value of what I'm spending my money on? And interesting, this point earlier made about how the Victorians funded things out of bonds because there was freer money available. I think now we've got mortgages and taxes which absorb most, certainly in the UK, most middle class incomes. There's not a lot of free cash. In fact, savings in this country have really plummeted over the last 10 years or so. So when people start to think about what I'm going to spend my money on, it actually it translates into what am I happy about government spending my taxes on, because to some degree that's the free money. That's the free money that's gone out of your bank account to government, and it's making choices on your behalf about what it's going to spend that money on. So they're translating some of those consumer choices, I think, into their views on government spending. But they also know that if they don't get a good sense of value out of what government is spending money on, or even private investors spending money on in infrastructure terms, they know what to do about it. They know where their rights are. They know they have the right to say they don't like it. And they also know now increasingly that if they say it loud enough and on great enough scale, they can stop it and they can change it and they can redirect things quite easily, or relatively easily, towards other ambitions. So I think what we're witnessing in the way in which projects are being developed and being delivered is a transformation in the arguments being made around them. At the heart of a number of the most successful projects in this country at the moment is a pretty traditional piece of infrastructure. And this image here is if you go to the website for the new King's Cross Plaza at King's Cross Station in central London, this is the image that greets you. It's not an image of a train sitting at a station or sitting at a platform. It's the image of a cafe, which just happens to have a railway next to it. So you can see that the transformational argument around investment, a major significant investment in an upgrade to a station, which is all about upgrading our infrastructure, has been transformed into one of personal experience for the consumer. And that satisfaction levels at King's Cross have gone from 40% saying they enjoyed using King's Cross prior to this project taking place, to 94% saying they think King's Cross is a wonderful destination. Very few of those respondents actually talk about the fact that it still operates trains. This image is what you get if you go to the Heathrow Terminal 5 website. It talks about having a personal shopper that can help you around the terminal. It doesn't talk about the runways that sit next to the terminal and the planes on the tarmac sitting outside. And in effect, they've created a shopping centre here with some runways next to it. And I think it sort of exemplifies the same thing. From an Olympic perspective, what we did, I think quite successfully, is generate a view that we needed to create a new district in London. We needed to regenerate a new district in London. And along that route, we just so happened to host an Olympic Games. And I think that argument is at the core of why it became such a success. And if you look at the current ratings around whether people felt we spent the money wisely, they are staggering. They're absolutely staggering. So 2/3 of the public believe the Olympics was worth the money, and 70% think it was a good use of public money. But of course, that wasn't always the case. We started probably, and apologies to any of you who are sensitive to some of the words used on the wall here, but it wasn't when we started out on this project 8 years ago or so. There were, I think, a good proportion of the public said, what a damn waste of money, we shouldn't be spending on this, we should be spending it on other things. So what caused the shift? Why did we manage to change people's minds? Well, I think there are 4 principles, and we mentioned principles just now in terms of what principles we drive into learnings around major projects. 4 principles that I think made the Olympics a success and have turned the public's opinion, and therefore allowed us very smoothly to deliver a very, very complex and expensive piece of infrastructure for East London. I would say the first is plan. Make sure you take the time to plan these projects. And out of that planning process comes a credible, value-based story. You then need to tell your story quite effectively through the engagement and the communication that you use, but it's not just about information, it's about the way in which you engage. And then you need to deliver that value, not just deliver the project, but deliver the value. And I think one of the value judgments in the Olympics is, have we got good buildings? Have we got buildings that will last, and will they be convertible over time? And I would argue that we have. It would have been much cheaper to build less higher quality and less versatile buildings. So let's just quickly whip through those principles. Plan, plan, plan. We had an Australian chief executive who pretended he knew about football, but really didn't know much about football. So he talked about a 2-4-1 formation. Those of you who do know about football, there's not enough players on the pitch. But he thought that would work in England. And it did, actually, because what it meant was that we would spend 2 years where nothing would happen on site. We'd spend 2 years planning. 4 years then building, and 1 year of testing. And we stuck absolutely rigidly to that program and told the world that's what we were going to do. We published numerous documents, etc., saying that was exactly what we were going to do. Don't worry, you can't see anything for 2 years. The building will start in 2 years' time when we know exactly what we want to do. And it was a very big risk at the time because there is a hunger immediately for projects around this to see progress, to see something coming out of the ground. But equally, there was probably a 10, 15-year period of planning that had gone on around this site from way before we got involved as the ODA in delivering the project. And this image just gives you a sense of what the site used to look like. And over time, actually, pieces of infrastructure have been added to this bit of London that created a platform on which the Olympics could never have happened if that investment hadn't happened and the foresight hadn't been there many, many, many years before that. When we took on the project, our planning consisted of these kind of modelling type exercises, which didn't look just to the games, which this image represents, but looked way beyond the games. In fact, they looked to 2050, not to define the architecture or the urban form, actually simply to define the infrastructure required under the ground to make this project last for 150 years. That enabled us, I think, then, to go to the next stage, which was to tell this value story, which translated very quickly into, we will spend, of every pound that you, the taxpayer, give us, we'll spend 75p of that on this 150-year plan into the future and investing in infrastructure, and only 25p of that on the Olympics as such, the temporary components that make up the games. And that was accompanied by this kind of imagery, as well as accompanied by the research, the consumer research that exists behind those kinds of statements, that proved how our thinking had been conceived and demonstrated exactly what we might deliver at umpteen depths of detail should you be interested. We published numerous strategies, numerous reports to help us explain that to those that are interested. When I talk about engagement and communication, I think we have to move away from the sense of consultation being engagement. Consultation is a process right at the beginning of a project like this, which we went through. But actually what really was succeeded in this project, I think, was the continuous engagement of people from a very diverse community and a very diverse stakeholder group who needed different ways in which they could engage with the project constantly throughout. And those ways needed to change throughout because the demands changed. So we met people on the street. We created facilities like this, the ViewTube, which was a community-owned structure in which school children could come and do their physics lessons whilst looking out at the Olympic Stadium and understand the physics behind the structure. They could even do their English lessons where we would talk about Stratford, but not the Stratford they were looking out on, but it still had some resonance when William Shakespeare further north would have probably cried when he saw the real Stratford down here. We also invested in a construction academy. This is Digger School. And only 17% of the people that passed through that construction academy ended up working on the Olympics. The remainder ended up working on construction sites across London. So we used the Olympics as a means of engaging people in an employment programme, if you like, to the benefit of the wider community and to the wider city. And we also then invested in tools to engage small businesses in the contract award process that enabled them to gain and collaborate together and gain contracts out of this great project. But interestingly, just about every public sector body in London now has taken on those same systems and tools. Some of us who are used to bidding regularly in public sector contracts would probably cry at some of the things there, but I can assure you it's a lot easier now than it was prior to some of the systems that we put in place. And then we moved to delivery, and one of the important things about the delivery on the Olympic project was that it started, once we'd got into that build period, we felt the need to demonstrate delivery regularly and demonstrate the delivery of value, not just the delivery of a physical outcome. So in 2011, the Stratford City project, which was the project adjacent to the Olympic Park, the Westfield Shopping Centre, as it sits at its heart, opened. It opened prior to the Olympics, and that was a very determined programme driver that sat behind that. We needed to demonstrate that we weren't just building a temporary Olympic Park for some games. We were building a legacy for this part of East London, and this was the beginning of that district, if you like. The following year, we finished most of the Olympic venues, and some of them were temporary. This is the temporary basketball venue. So we had to quite quickly explain that this represents 25p of your pound, and the remaining 75p was still yet to come. So we continued with the imagery that explained that, and continued with the engagement that kept explaining that. And that principle still exists today. This is the image actually of the southern park that is being constructed right now, which still represents to some degree that 25p, because what will follow is the 75p's worth of new housing and new commercial investment that will take some 25 years to emerge as markets start to drive it, but the infrastructure is there to support it. So that argument, that way in which we made the value case, I think still persists. And as a consequence, we are still witnessing now something that's completely the buck to the trend of any previous Olympics, where there has been this massive drop-off in public interest and public support for the project as soon as the games, the event are over. In London, there has been a minor drop-off, but all the polls are telling us that there's still support and still consistent interest in the Olympic Park, both from investors and from the public, because there's a sense, at least, that things are still developing, that the infrastructure is there to accommodate this growth, and that the end story, that value story, is still attached to the project. So apply all of that back to all of these other projects, and I think what we've got to ask ourselves as we get into the delivery of other infrastructure projects is, are we making the right value case that sits behind those projects? And I'll leave you thinking about that. I have some very personal views about the value case that might exist around HS2, and I would argue that we're probably not making the right value case at the moment in the public domain, and yet there is such a strong one to be made. That's where I'm going to leave it.